You're on.
Tonight our topic is in Hilchos 101. The next chapter of Hilchos 101 are the halachos, or the customs and more related to chinuch. Chinuch being education. The main thrust of the question we're going to be looking at tonight is, when does the mitzvah of chinuch end? If indeed it is a mitzvah, which is an interesting question in and of itself. I'm not going to get into that. But despite that question, of course, there are a number of psukim in the Torah which, and beyond the Torah, the most famous one is actually the Mishlei, about related to education, the education of children specifically, or children in general, and sons more specifically. There's interesting reference points in certain sources in halacha addressing how chinuch relates to daughters. Of course, in modern times, we kind of include the daughters. I think it's pretty universally accepted. To what extent and to what degree what is taught to the girls is still out there in terms of the conversation that, if it's to be had amongst different factions of Judaism, how much girls are educated, and in terms of what the topics are, etc., is an interesting discussion, which we're not going to get into now. Suffice it to say that we...
Am I late?
No.
We started at 8:10, but we educate the children. We educate the children, boys and girls, in whatever manner that we do, depending on the different schools of thought. No pun intended in terms of schools, but in certainly the modern Orthodox community, girls are given essentially the same education as the boys, and this, I think, is a good thing. So the order that I'm going to be following tonight is essentially, I've got about six pieces to an outline, which I have in my head, which I didn't make for you, but an outline of sorts, which is going to follow in this way. Number one, I'm just going to share with you the sources, the biblical sources, and the like. Following that, we're going to define what I'm going to give different definitions of what chinuch is. Chinuch, generally speaking, we translate to mean education, but there are other meanings as well. One of the questions was, when does chinuch end? So we're going to look at the different ages for chinuch as defined in the halachic sources. Does it go beyond, let's say, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah age? Who is responsible to be the mechanech? Is it the father, the mother? Is it other people? Is it grandparents? And finally, we'll conclude with a number of examples of chinuch responsibilities for children as defined in halachic sources. And the end is going to make reference to Pesach, because Pesach is such an important time for the involvement of children. And of course, we know that from four of the psukim which we refer to in the Haggadah, the psukim which the Haggadah refers to as the four sons, most of which appear in the book of Shemos, chapters 12 and 13, surrounding the tale of the death of the firstborns and the aftermath. And they are, when your children are going to ask you, what's this all about? So the Torah tells us what our responsibility is to tell them. You tell them all about the Pesach. The other psukim in there are in chapter 13. There's no question which is stimulating the response. The Haggadah is a different way of saying it, but nonetheless, you have to tell your children about to tell your children about the Exodus from Egypt, and that is a key component of their education. When your children are going to ask in the future, what is this all about? And you're going to tell them, that God took us out of Egypt with his mighty hand. And finally, specifically in the context of Pesach, they're going to be asking you, what are all these rules, etc. And then you're going to tell them, that we were servants or slaves rather, to Paro in Egypt. So those are the four psukim as it relates to Pesach when it comes to having to communicate with children. And of course, when it comes to the Haggadah, as a result, when we make the different aspects of the Seder that we have, they're heavily involved and focus on the children so that the children stay awake. This is why we have the manishtana. This is why we're always taking out the seder plate and uncovering the matzah and having multiple cups of wine and dipping and all the things that the manishtana references. Even though by the time we're saying the manishtana, basically none of them have happened yet. But anyway, there is this focus on the children when it comes to the seder. We have in the Torah, we have the pasuk Sha'alavicha v'yagedcha zekenecha v'yamulach. You have to ask your fathers, and they will tell you, and your elders zekenecha, and they will tell you as well. So that indicates that the children at least have the responsibility to seek information and knowledge from their parents and from their grandchildren and from their grandparents. And presumably, if the children are seeking from those people, then those people have to respond in kind. We say in the Shema every day, you have to teach your children, and you're going to speak to them about these rules and these mitzvos. That is a mitzvah d'oraisa to teach your children. We also have the most famous line about chinuch, which is Chanoch l'nar al pi darkos from Mishlei. You have to educate the child per his ways of understanding. We have a similar notion, by the way, with Pesach. You have to teach the child according to the way they understand, which is talked about in the Mishnah Psachim. But in any case, Chanoch l'nar al pi darkos, teach the child according to its ways, in other words, how the child understands. This is very popular today. A popular methodology when it comes to education today is that children have different ways of learning. Some are more hands-on. Some are more intellectual. Some are more experiential. These are different ways of teaching, and that's what the first half of the pasuk is telling us. And the second half says, "Gam ki lo yasur mimenu," that also as the child gets older, the education that has been given to the child shouldn't leave from him. So these are the biblical sources primarily. There is, just with reference to the Sha'alavicha v'yagedcha zekenecha v'yamulach, you have to ask the parents, or you have to ask or speak to the grandparents or the elders. So in his book, I don't remember which one, but I think it's Ramach HaShulchan, Rabbi Ari Enkin. We have the whole series here of his Daled Amos of Halacha. So he has one chapter related to education of children from the perspective of how far does it need to go. And he writes there, make no mistake, even according to the opinion that the mitzvah of kibud av va'im does not apply to grandparents, because there's a whole discussion as to whether children need to if they fulfill the mitzvah of kibud av va'im, honoring their parents through honoring their grandparents. Okay, some say yes, because since your father has the obligation, or your parents have the obligation to honor their parents, and honoring of your parents is honoring your grandparents. Okay, but nonetheless, there is the viewpoint that says that there isn't that mitzvah directly to children to honor their grandparents through the mitzvah of kibbud av va'im, but he says one is nevertheless still required to honor one's grandparents under the clause of v'hadarta p'nei zakein, the mitzvah to honor all elders. So it becomes a two-way street in terms of how children relate to their grandparents, and of course how their grandparents relate to their grandchildren. I don't think I need to explain that much here. We're preaching to a choir of people who love their grandchildren very much. Okay, so the next question which we're going to look at is how we define chinuch. So chinuch, in and of itself, the general terminology, especially nowadays when we talk about schools, chinuch is usually translated as education. But when you look at the word chinuch in the Torah, chinuch doesn't necessarily mean education. It's usually talking about, anybody? Chanoch, right? Chanoch is the builder. Right? What is chinuch? And chanukas hamizbeach is dedication or a foundation. Okay, chinuch really means giving a foundation of sorts to the people who are being the recipients of that chinuch. So much so, and by the way, the Aruch HaShulchan is such a fantastic source in terms of his viewpoints about chinuch and what responsibilities of children are in terms of halacha and mitzvos. The Aruch HaShulchan makes it so clear that what chinuch really is about training. He has a passage in the laws of Shabbos in which he says, a katan, a minor, somebody who's under bar mitzvah. A katan is not defined by just being somebody who's 3, 4, 5, but anybody who's under bar mitzvah. He says it's pater mikol mitzvos, exempt from all mitzvos. They don't have to fulfill mitzvos. and the father doesn't have to be so careful that they fulfill mitzvos. Goes on to say that even if the minor eats nevelos, non-kosher meat. I don't mean non-kosher like pig, but non-shechted cow, for example. Okay, we don't have to. We're not commanded to take that food away from the child. He's eating again. Let's assume that it's a cow, beef, not pig meat, but because that's an Isser Torah. But so is nevela, but it's different. But if the child's eating what we would call a non-kosher hot dog, okay, you don't take it away from him if the child is under bar mitzvah. Okay, you don't have to do that. So the Aruch HaShulchan says, so what's the whole point of chinuch? He says, the child is going to fulfill mitzvos kishiyagdil when he gets older. But if he doesn't know Torah at all when he is a child, until he gets to that point, then what's he going to be? He's going to be kefera adam. What's fera adam? That's the way that Yishmael is described in the Torah. Right, a donkey of a man. What does the donkey do? Doesn't fulfill mitzvos. Okay, v'yetzei letarbos ra, and he'll go off in the wrong direction. Ein Torah in mitzvos. Because if he doesn't know Torah, he's not going to fulfill mitzvos, and therefore the Torah obligates the parent to educate the child, to train the child to be aware of what mitzvos are, what the Torah is all about, so that when the child comes to the age of 13, they are trained and they're ready. I just look at, and I don't want to put any movement in a box, but think about the movement that just trains for the bar mitzvah and doesn't train for after the bar mitzvah. Okay, what do those children do after bar mitzvah? Again, in generalization, okay, understood. They disappear because they're not given the training to stick it out necessarily. Again, it's a generalization, but we know how true, unfortunately, it is. When it comes to davening, the Torah tells us, says for children when they reach the point of the age of chinuch, which we're going to define soon. You have to bring them regularly to shul so that they're trained to do that. Other things that they need to have training for. Kissing the Torah and giving kavod Torah, standing when the Torah is brought out. You teach them a love for the Torah. We train them to say brachos. Again, this is all from the Aruch HaShulchan. You train them to say brachos. That even though their brachos are not necessarily, maybe they don't even know what they're saying. A bracha, there's a whole debate amongst the authorities whether we say amen to a child who says a bracha, because they don't really know what the bracha means. Are they talking to God? Do they have an understanding of that? So the answer is it doesn't matter. We train them to say the brachos, and when they get to an age where we think that they understand at least what they're saying, or that there's a God, and that they understand that there's what it means to say a bracha to God, then at that point we say amen. But certainly as early as we can to teach them to say brachos. My favorite story is about my yo-yo. One time we were eating at a breakfast on Sunday morning in the Young Israel Hollywood, and he went to wash for his bagel. And as he was running back to his bagel, I was washing one of the other kids' hands. I said to him, "Don't forget to say hamotzi." So he picks up his bagel and he says, "Hamotzi." I think he was 3 years old at the time. But nonetheless, the whole idea is to train with reference to brachos. The Rambam talks about how if a child is eating non-kosher food, if they're doing muktzah, how if they're not at an age where they understand, you don't take it away from them on Shabbos or if they're eating non-kosher food. But once they do understand, then you take it away from them and you let them know, no, this is Shabbos. No, we eat kosher because, we're trying to train. When it comes to speech, the Rambam tells us in Hilchos Shavuos that you want to teach the children to say l'lamed l'shonam divrei emes v'lo shvua, to tell the truth and not to make any swears because we value how much we make the promises. I remember as a kid we always said, "I swear if I could," because we were taught you're not supposed to make a swear, you're not supposed to make a promise. Similarly, that if a child does make a promise, we force them, we enforce the promise which they made, so they should know that speech is very important, and they should be held to their words. The Shulchan Aruch has in the laws of lulav, for example, it says that if a child knows how to shake the lulav properly, then we should do it. And the Mishabura goes on to say if you can actually afford to get a lulav in Estro, because it's available, and at times it wasn't, and so there was only one in town. But certainly nowadays we know that it's so readily available, thank God. He says, get them a kosher lulav in Estro and make sure that they're doing it right. I remember a number of years ago when I was in Camp Moshava, so Rabbi Binyamin Tabori, who was one of the rabbeim in Gush Etzion, he was there for the summer, and he was asked the question as to whether if there isn't enough time, or if it's a heavy schedule in camp, whether you should make whether you should make what they call for chazaras hashatz, a hechesh shmona esrei, right? To do a half chazaras hashatz, where you don't do the full shmona esrei followed by a full chazaras hashatz, but you do a half. And he said he gets asked this question for schools as well, whether it's the right thing to do, and he made the point, which relates to this, that if you're going to do it, especially when you're teaching children, do it right. Do it right. Don't do a half. There's a time and place to do a half shmona esrei when you're in a rush. But in a school, don't be in a rush. Make sure you do it right. This is the kids need to learn how you do it correctly. And I think that law with reference to lulav and the shaking of the lulav is reminiscent of that idea. The Aruch HaShulchan tells us that when it comes to the training of children and education of children, don't learn new things with them on Shabbos. He says because Shabbos is just a hard time for them to process. So they're resting, or their minds are on other things, and they can't write anything down. He says just do chazara with them, make it fun for them on Shabbos. Review things which they may have learned, because you want to give them a good feeling for Shabbos as well. If the children, they should learn not to eat before Kiddush, for example, on Shabbos, not to eat before they daven. But the Mishnah Berurah says, for example, that if they're too weak, or if they need weak is not the right word, but if they need the strength that comes from the food in order to do these things properly, again, getting to the idea that they need to be able to do them properly, so then they'll learn eventually that you don't eat before davening, you don't eat before Kiddush and Shabbos, okay. But at the point in time when they're in the middle of chinuch, then or they're during their training days, so there is room to allow for these things, despite their not being exactly 100% correct. Rav Moshe Feinstein has a tshuva in Yerodea Chelek Dalet, part 4, Siman Lamed Aleph, in which he was asked about the obligation of teachers to teach their students, and he says when you are teaching with children, he says teach them, don't waste, don't neglect the quantity and the quality. They have to learn in the highest level that you can possibly give them. He says, a teacher should challenge the students according to their level. And he says in our country, I think he was in the United States at the time for sure, he says there's an obligation on every teacher, every Rav, Umore, Umelamed, so every kind of teacher that's in the school system, to make sure that they are Lintoa b'libos hatalmidim emuna b'Hashem Yisbarach b'Torasah Kedosha, to implant inside the hearts of the students faith in God and faith in the Torah, the Holy Torah, and to lechancham b'midos tovos v'derech eretz, to train them, to educate them with good character traits and derech eretz. Ki ein l'smoch al mashi yischanchum b'bayis v'sviva klal. Because you cannot rely on what they get on the home alone and in their general environment alone. They need it reinforced from the people who can educate them and who are given so much time with them. So Rav Moshe Feinstein is supporting what we've been saying up until now, that chinuch is all about training and bringing the kids close to the idea that if we only value the Torah, which has been given to us, then it becomes valued to us, hopefully, throughout our lives. Okay, so what age is chinuch? What age is chinuch? Believe it or not, you'd think it would be something which is straightforward, but it's not. It's not straightforward, because for different mitzvos and for different stages of a child's life and existence, the ages are different. And in so many different sources in Shulchan Aruch, they'll throw out numbers like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, and you really see all these numbers, because it really depends on what it is that we're talking about. I mean, even for tzitzis, for example, a lot of people are familiar with the idea that as soon as a child is toilet trained, you're going to give them tzitzis. But there is really an obligation. Aruch HaShulchan says this, the Mishnah Berurah kind of hints to this as well, that there isn't really an obligation to wear tzitzis. The obligation is if you have a 4-cornered garment, then you put tzitzis on it. Okay, we still say it's a very easy mitzvah, let's give it to the children to do, but it's not so clear that needs to be done at such an early stage. Certainly by the time a child reaches bar mitzvah, we want the child to be wearing tzitzis on a regular basis, but of course bar mitzvah is 13. When it comes to the mitzvah of Shema, okay, so the Shulchan Aruch says that minors who have not yet reached the age of chinuch, which he defines as I mean, the Mishnah Berurah defines it as 6 or 7. They don't have to read. They don't have to say the Shema. And the Mishnah Berurah says, why 6 or 7? And believe it or not, the father doesn't even have the obligation to give it, to teach it over to the child. Why? Because in the morning, the father is not usually davening with the child. In the evening, when the child goes to bed, he's assuming the father isn't there either. So he says, yeah, the father needs to arrange in some way that the child does it, but it doesn't become his obligation anymore, as much as, in general, davening is. But there you have, for that, you have 6 or 7. However, the Mishnah Berurah goes further and says that at what point in time is the father obligated to make sure the child knows Shema, De'imhu ben yud beis shana, l'kulei alma hutal aviv l'chancha b'zeh. Age 12, okay, for Shema. For Torah study. Torah study, the Rambam tells us, 6 or 7, and not before that. Okay, so much for the Mishnah and Avos saying at 5, you have to start learning Chumash. Okay, he says, but 6 or 7, and not earlier than that. The Bach tells us for the mitzvah of tzitzis, age 9. When it comes to Yom Kippur, so Yom Kippur, the Aruch HaShulchan tells us that a child under the age of 9, no responsibilities whatsoever. Starting at age 9, you have the kid wait, 1 hour into the day. At age 10, 2 hours into the day. Age 11, 3 hours into the day. And he goes on to describe how obviously a girl at age 12 and a boy at age 13 have full responsibility. It's unclear whether at the bat mitzvah year or the bar mitzvah year whether they have a full responsibility. Certainly at the next year they do, because the question is, what are they at that stage as they turn bar mitzvah? So I guess it really depends on how old they are past that. But there is a notion, certainly when it comes to Yom Kippur and all mitzvahs in general, there is a debate whether chinuch ends officially, the chinuch officially ends at bar bat mitzvah, or whether it's puberty, which is the onset. Nowadays we don't check for puberty, and so therefore it is. We put all the children into the category of 12 for a girl and 13 for a boy, but that is that. When it comes to the mitzvah of sukkah, so the Shulchan Aruch tells us that what's the criteria? Not an age, although he does mention 5 or 6, but a child who eino tzarech li'imo, doesn't need his mother. That's a child who is in the sukkah. Why? Because the mother doesn't have the obligation to be in the sukkah, and if she has a smaller child in the home, so she's going to be inside, presumably taking care of the baby. Again, even though generally speaking, the women bring the children and the babies out to the sukkah, but in the event that a baby needs to be inside, so it's only a child who's completely independent who needs to be in the sukkah, and that's when chinuch kicks in when it comes to sukkahs. When chinuch ends, I mentioned before. Okay, so now the question is about what is the longer term beyond the chinuch years. So in Rabbi Inkin's book, in the article that I quoted before, he mentions this probably gets more into the next section that we'll be talking about, which is whether it's the father, the mother, or the other. But I thought it was related here. But he writes the following: he says, "It seems that a grandfather, or I guess I would say grandparents, has an obligation to ensure that his grandchildren receive a proper Torah education in the event that the parents are not able to do so." And he quotes the Shulchan Aruch Harav, Hilchos Talmud Torah 1:8. In fact, he goes on, in the event that parents cannot afford to pay the tuition fees for their children's Torah education, a Beit Din can force the grandparents to do so, should they have the means, and he quotes for that, that's where he quotes the Shulchan Aruch Harav. The earlier source was Kiddushin 30a, the Kesef Mishnah, and Hilchos Talmud Torah, and the Rambam, Shach and Yerodei. He has a number of sources here, which, including the Shvus Yaakov, who talks about great-grandchildren. Okay, the point being that any children or grandchildren that are going to be having tuition is presumably going to be beyond ages 12 and 13. We want them to be continuing their education. So that would imply that it's not just that chinuch doesn't end when children reach the age of mitzvos. Chinuch goes on after that. There's a tshuva written by Menashe Klein in the Shelos Tshuvas sorry. That was Rabbi Ten joke. Mishnah Halachos, not Mishana Halachos. Mishnah Halachos, okay? Mishana Halachos means who changes the laws. Mishnah Halachos means who studies the laws. Okay, in which he addresses the question of the mitzvah of chinuch, after kids hit the age of bar mitzvah. And he says, it's true. It's true that after the age of bar mitzvah, the mitzvah of chinuch ends. But he goes on to say that that doesn't mean that there isn't instruction which is to be given. And he quotes a number of sources who talk about whether the age of Further instruction is from 16 to 22, 18 to 24. Now, reminding us of that line that Mark Twain said. Right, remember what did he say? From the age of 14 to 21, it was amazing to see how much my parents learned. Right. So the idea being that there is that window in time when it's not so much chinuch as much as it's hochacha, and he says that the mitzvah of hocheach tochiach, right, to instruct and to give, the kind of rebuke which could be accepted, does continue to fall into play until essentially the child is no longer a child and is really an adult to all intents and purposes. But really, hocheach tochiach, the idea of giving instruction, or again, we'll just call it constructive criticism to people beyond the age of just 12, 13, bar bat mitzvah, is always in place according to Rabbi Klein's tshuva, and that goes on well beyond the bar mitzvah years. Okay, so who has the responsibility to do chinuch? Is it just the father? Is it just the mother? Or is it other people as well? So the Rambam warns us in the laws of Talmud Torah that a melamed hatinokos is not a father or a mother, it's a hired teacher who neglects the children and does other things with them and therefore neglects their learning. He's in violation of the curse of Arur Osem Meleches Hashem Ramiyah. Curse is the one who does trickery with the work of God. So it's very important to bear in mind that a teacher is not necessarily a father or a mother, but that you need to have the right person who is involved in doing it. Presumably a father and mother, they're the right people for their children, and hopefully they do a good job. And if they need instruction, they should seek that out. But if they're hiring a teacher, they need to get the right person. Okay, I mentioned before why the father doesn't have to teach the Shema to his child, because he's not necessarily around. But nonetheless, the father does have responsibility to teach tefillah to his child. However, one of my favorite stories, I heard this from Alan Fagan, who is now the president of OU, and I heard this way before he was the president of OU, but he also wrote it in one of his inaugural letters in the Jewish Action magazine. He told the story about when he became the president of the Queen Jewish Center. So the rabbi, a longtime rabbi at the Queen Jewish Center, was Rabbi Joseph Grumblad, wonderful, awesome, one of the awesomest rabbis I've ever met in my life. And Rabbi Grumblad said to Alan Fagan, he said to him, I'd like you to be the next president of the shul. And Mr. Fagan's response was, I sit with my kids during davening, and it's very important for their chinuch, and it's very important for all the reasons that any father would argue about why he should sit with his kids during davening. And Rabbi Grumblad said to Alan Fagan, he said, anybody can sit with your kids and they'll learn davening from being in the shul, but they will learn more from seeing you do Osek B'Tzorech Tzibur. You're playing a leadership role in the shul when you're sitting up here with me on Shabbos, than if you're just sitting there next to you. Somebody else can take care of the chinuch. Okay? And Alan Fagan said, Rabbi Grumblad was right. Okay? And the point that I take from that story is that yes, the father does have the obligation, but other people can take that role. My greatest personal memory in terms of learning davening is my father, as you all know, is a rabbi in a shul. So when it came to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, he would float around to the different minyanim, and I always davened in one minyan. I remember when I must have been around 6 or 7. He asked an older gentleman in the shul, Ruby Bodek, Zichrono Livracha, who was a rabbi and a chaplain and a very interesting fellow. He said, "Can Avi sit next to you during davening?" And I learned Rosh Hashanah davening and Yom Kippur davening sitting next to Rabbi Ruby Bodek. And to this day, I'm grateful to him because of the role which he played in my chinuch. Okay, so that's in terms of that. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan tells us in the laws of Shabbos, addressing what happens if the father dies. If the father is gone. So where does upon whom does the responsibility of chinuch fall? And the answer is on the apotroposim. In other words, the people who are those who take care of the estate, they have the responsibility. There's I'm not going to call it a debate, but it goes back and forth in different sources about how, for example, the Aruch HaShulchan says in Siman Tov Reish Mem, Hachinuch mutal ala av, that the chinuch is responsibilities on the father. Ve'im ein av, if there's no father, imo mechanachto, then the mother has to do the chinuch. Ve'im ein lo ava ein, and if there's no father and mother, based in mechanchino. So the responsibility falls upon the court to do it. And there are those who say, no, chinuch is only on the father, it's only the father's responsibility. What about if a child? I mentioned before the idea about a child who's eating nevelos. So if the child is of a chinuch age, who has to take the food away from him, assuming that he understands? So ideally the father, but if there's no father, then other people need to kick in. Other people need to step up to the plate and do that. When it comes to Purim, the Mishnah Berurah tells us that we say the Pesukim and the Megillah out loud, right? The 4 Pesukim. Ishi Yehudi Hayah B'Shushan Abira, right? Mordechai Yatzam Melech Now L'Losh Machos LaYehuda Ma'asar B'Simcha Ki Mordechai Yehudi. Right? We say those 4 Pesukim out loud. Why the Mishnah Berurah says Kidei L'Chancha B'Mitzvahs Pursuing Nisa, to educate the children in the mitzvah of publicizing the miracle. Who says those Pesukim aloud? Just the parents? No, it's the whole community. So we see there, it's just an example of everybody teaching the children to how to do pursuing Nisa, to publicize the miracle. That is something which is incumbent upon everybody. I mentioned before that we train the children to kiss the Torah. The Aruch HaShulchan says that who does that? Who's involved in that? Is it only the parents? Is it only the father who's carrying the Torah? Is it only the parent who's encouraging children to kiss the Torah? I remember once reading one of these Hasidic tales about this family that didn't have any children, and they went over to the Rebbe. The Rebbe said, "What am I supposed?" They said, "Can you give us a bracha?" The Rebbe said, "Let me do you one more. Not just will I give you a bracha, but you have to be involved in the lives of children." And in the story it goes that they get heavily involved in education and helping the kids kiss the Torah in the shul and showing them, or opening up their own kodesh, etc. And as the story goes in this tale like this, they're blessed with a child. But the point is that they're involved in the education of children and in the training of children, so they should have a love for Torah, mitzvos, etc. When it comes to Yom Kippur, so the Mishnah Berurah describes how the mother's obligation is there as well. I want to share with you something that Rabbi Soloveitchik wrote. Not that he wrote, Rabbi Ziegler wrote it in one of the books of the laws of Rabbi Soloveitchik's halachic ruling. So he talks about how the Mishnah in Talmud and Brachos states that a katan, a child under the age of bar mitzvah, is exempt from the mitzvah of Kriya Shema and Tefillin, but is required to fulfill the mitzvah of Tefillah, davening, mezuzah, and birchas hamazon. That's what the Mishnah says. And the question is, why? What's the whole point? Why is a child exempt from one and obligated to the other? And the bottom line is, he says that the child has a different appreciation for the mitzvos of Tefillah, Mezuzah, and Birchas Hamazon than they do for Kriya Shema and Tefillin. And he goes on to describe how Rabbi Soloveitchik would say the rabbis place the obligation of the mitzvah on the katan himself, on the child, in order to train him to become proficient in their performance when he reaches the age of bar mitzvah. Therefore, he has to do the last 3 mitzvahs of the Mishnah. Remember, those last 3 are davening, a mezuzah, and benching. But he's exempt from the first 2, which were Shema and Tefillin. However, according to Ramban, the rabbis place the obligation of chinuch exclusively upon the parents. They must train their child in the performance of mitzvahs, but he is under no obligation to do those mitzvahs until he becomes 13. Hence, it's incumbent upon the parents to see that the child does the last 3 mitzvahs in the Mishnah, but not to concern themselves with the first 2 mitzvahs. According to Rabbi Soloveitchik, the Rambam understood the Mishnah to be referring to a katan who is capable of comprehension. So this is how he explains it. Regarding tefillah, mezuzah, birkas hamazon, davening, and benching, and the mezuzah, he is required to fulfill them on his own behalf on a rabbinic level. But regarding tefillin, which requires an adult level of handling because of their holiness, and in terms of the conduct of the body and making sure not to talk, etc., and Kriya Shema, which demands an adult level of being mikabel ol malchus shamayim, of accepting the yoke of heaven, the rabbis didn't impose this on a minor. What remains for these 2 mitzvahs is merely the parental obligation of chinuch to train the child in order to do it. So Rabbi Soloveitchik added that these differences only apply to the performance of positive commandments, but regarding all negative commandments, the mitzvah is never upon the minor, but always the exclusive responsibility of the parents, based on the verse of Chanoch L'Nar Al Pi Darko. One other thought that Rabbi Soloveitchik had, in a different article in the 5th volume, is that in this world we're only held responsible for our own actions and deeds, but in heaven a person will have to give reckoning, a cheshbon, for the type of children and grandchildren left behind. These offspring can be a great asset for the departed soul, or unfortunately sometimes a great liability. A father's legacy is tied to his children's character. In the Gemara Sukkah, we find that the entire family of Bilga was penalized because of the behavior of their children. In concluding this segment, Rabbi Soloveitchik's viewpoint was that just as a father's legacy is tied to his children's character, and therefore grandchildren, right, as well, so is a leader's fate bound to his people's destiny. If the people are not worthy, because he went on to describe a comparison between parents and leaders. Essentially, I don't need to get into the leader, but he says parents likewise have to bear this in mind, as they will someday be called upon to furnish a din v'cheshbon. Din is over after we leave this world. The cheshbon is not. So the question of legacy is really something which everybody always needs to bear in mind on account of the fact that that goes on forever. What's our legacy? What's our legacy? Is it just something which we see in our lifetimes, or is our legacy the people who we always count as our grandchildren, great-grandchildren, long after we're gone? It's a true, right? You know, every now and then you hear about some Hollywood actor, actress who's a descendant of the Vilna Gaon. Now we admire the Vilna Gaon tremendously, right? But what does that say about the descendants? And this is not to judge the Vilna Gaon. It's not his fault. But nonetheless, it's just a question to ponder when we think about what Rabbi Soloveitchik just said. Okay, I'm going to conclude here with a few examples of responsibilities of chinuch responsibilities for children. I have a lot of things here which I put together, some of which I've already mentioned. So I'm just going to quickly go through the hit list without reading the sources inside. Number one is benching. I mentioned before. I mentioned also the debate about daughters. The Aruch HaShulchan, on the one hand, he says, "Banos einan b'chinuch lebirkas hamazon." You don't have to educate daughters for benching. But in a different section in Shin Men Gimel, he talks about how it's a good idea to teach daughters how to bench as well. So it's clarified there. Lulav, I mentioned before. Megillah, we went into detail, a little bit of detail about that. Kriyas Torah, it's important to raise children to appreciate and to value Torah reading and to hear it. That's why we give them an aliyah, for example, every year on Simchas Torah, right? The Kol HaNa'arim is to teach children that you stand near the Torah, you make a bracha over the Torah. That is that mitzvah as well. When it comes to sitting in the sukkah, we mentioned before about how a child needs to be able to handle it or not need his mother. Shabbos, when it comes to carrying, there is an interesting discussion in the Shulchan Aruch about whether, if there's a child who's present and there isn't an eruv, whether you're allowed to have the child pick up something. So the distinction is made between whether the child knows that they're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. If they're unaware, so it's one thing. But the other distinction is made is having the child get something because they think they're being helpful versus, I know that that's daddy's, I'm going to go get it. If they know that it's daddy's and they're going to go get it, then they shouldn't do it, versus if they're just going to pick it up because it's there. Yom Kippur, when it comes to Yom Kippur, so we are supposed to educate the children about the rules of Yom Kippur. So the truth is, the Aruch HaShulchan tells us that children are allowed to eat, drink, they're allowed to wash, they're allowed to do sicha, the anointing oils on Yom Kippur when they need to. The only thing that we educate children about on Yom Kippur specifically is shoes, not to wear leather shoes. What's the reason why? At least the way the Aruch HaShulchan explains it. Because children are often taking off their shoes anyway. So once they're taking off their shoes and walking around barefoot, we may as well tell them, all right, these shoes you don't need to wear today, and you can go ahead. And it's just something which they can be educated about. And generally speaking, we're actually very good about that. There's a very interesting thing about Rosh Hashanah. If Rosh Hashanah falls out on Shabbos, and so we don't blow the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, which falls out on Shabbos. But are you allowed to encourage a child to practice blowing shofar on Shabbos? There isn't a Torah prohibition against blowing the shofar on Shabbos. We don't do it because of carrying, which is a different discussion. But because now we have an eruv and all that, we still don't do it. But are you allowed to encourage a child to blow the shofar? And if you're not allowed to encourage a child to blow a shofar on Shabbos, if they do you have to stop them? And the answer is, again, the circumstances are a little complex, but generally speaking, we would say no, because we want them to appreciate the mitzvah of shofar on Rosh Hashanah. The Mishnah Berurah talks about Galila. The Galila, it's interesting because he says, mitzvahs Galila afki rabahi. It's a great honor. What would you think? Picking up the Torah or rolling the Torah is a greater honor? What would you think? So a lot of people would think Hagla. It's a big thing, picking up. But the answer is that Galila is more important. He says even though it's greater to do the Galila, to roll the Torah, The minhag is to give it to children. Again, it's to give them a love for the Torah. That's why we give them Galila. Why are we not giving them Hagba? Because they'll drop it, okay? Presumably they can't hold it yet. But Galila we can give them. And there is I want to mention as an aside, the Mishnah Berurah here, unfortunately we don't have any Gabayim here, but we should let the Gabayim know that the Mishnah Berurah says there, we should be careful only to give Hagba to somebody who can hold it, and somebody who can actually turn and show the words to everybody. If somebody could just pick it up and sit down, that person should really not be getting Hagba. So that's an aside, not related to Chinuch. Mezuzah, mentioned before. Benching, also mentioned before. Brachos, Kiddush, we should train kids for this. Even though they don't have to necessarily hear Kiddush before their bar mitzvah, but we want them to hear Kiddush. So if they eat before Kiddush, not the worst thing, but nonetheless we want them to do so. So much so that the halacha is that even normally I don't say Kiddush unless I'm going to eat, or if I'm going to be motzi people. The children, they don't need to hear Kiddush. So, but even if I'm not going to be eating, I can say Kiddush for them because it's for chinuch. If children are saying bracha, if children are going to be eating, even if I'm not eating, I can say bracha with Shem u'Malchus, with God's name, because it's for chinuch. If a child is unfortunately a mourner, they don't have to tear their clothing, but we tear their clothing anyway for chinuch purposes. If a parent is going to do aliyah l'regel, right, to go up to Jerusalem for a holiday, they take the child along for chinuch. A child who's a kohen, for chinuch reasons, even as a baby, he doesn't go into a cemetery, chinuch, because we want to teach the child about Tumah and Tahara. How far does that go? When I was in high school, I had a teacher who was a Kohen, not religious Jew. His last name was Khan, and there was Rabbi David Lifshitz's wife. Rabbi Lifshitz had already passed away. His wife passed away while I was a senior in high school, and they had the funeral in the Beis Medrash, the main Beis Medrash in YU, which at the time was in the main building. Now it's in the library. They built a building next to the library, so that's where the main Beis Medrash is. But anyway, the main Beis Medrash was in the same building as MTA, as the high school. So I remember I went out. The funeral was going on. I didn't go to the funeral because we had class and everything. But one of the rabbeim in the school, Rabbi Cohen, took all the kohanim in the school and brought them to a different building because the Rebbetzin Lifshitz was in the building, and he taught them shir in the morning during the funeral. So I went up to the teachers' lounge during lunchtime, and I saw Dr. Khan, and I was thinking, maybe he's, I don't know, maybe. So I said to him, so Dr. Khan, how's it going? Shooting the breeze with him, and he says, he gets all serious for a second. He says, so, is that funeral still going on? I said, I think it is. He says, I probably shouldn't be in the building, right? Clearly, your parents taught you something, even though you're not observant today, and that was just very interesting. Okay, the last point I said I wanted to finish with Pesach, and that is where we're up to. And of course, the Shulchan Aruch, when it discusses Pesach, and it discusses the involvement of children, so we're familiar with the Manishtana, of course, and the different things which we do in order to engage the children and to keep them involved and educated. And this goes to anybody. In other words, it's the Gadol Habayis, it's the head of the household who is going to be doing this. So anybody who is, if you're visiting your children, so maybe the whoever's house you're at, they're considered the Gadol Habayis, but nonetheless, there are people who, even when their parents are visiting, they say, Mom, Dad, you're the Gadol Habayis, really, even though it's my house, but I'd like you to lead the Seder. So then who's the mitzvah of chinuch for these children upon? Is it just their parents, or is it anybody who is in their lives? Remember, it's about the legacy. So it really includes everybody. And how far does it extend? There is a discussion here about if the child leads the Seder. So the child's not supposed to lead the Seder, but in Hallel, they're encouraged to lead Ana Hashem Hoshiana, and not as opposed to Hodul Hashem Kitov and Yomar Na Yisrael. What's the difference? Because for Ana Hashem Hoshiana, the people who respond are just responding by repeating what the child said. I don't know why this distinction is made, whereas for Hodul Hashem Kitov, what's the response to Hodul Hashem Kitov? Well, the first one, it's a repeat. But for Yomar Na Yisrael, what's the response? It's a different, it's Hodul Hashem Kitov. So it's a different response. So a child can do Ana Hashem Hoshiana and Ana Hashem Tzlichana, but not the other one. Okay, I don't completely understand the reason for that, but in any case, that is what's mentioned here. And of course, all the different things which we do, such as, like the Rambam mentions, the Aruch HaShulchan mentions it as well, giving out sweets so the children will ask questions. The whole point at Pesach is for the children to be asking questions and to be involved, to be engaged. Whether we're hiding the afikomen, whether we're asking them questions, whether we're telling them the story and having them involved, it's a responsibility upon everybody, not just their parents. I mean, obviously their parents first and foremost, but their grandparents as well. So just to sum up, we've seen a number of we saw the biblical sources for the mitzvah, not for the mitzvah, or the idea of chinuch, and we saw that in general chinuch means training, and training means to get the children to love what it is that we live for, what it is that our lives are about. That is extremely significant. We saw the different ages for chinuch based on what it is specifically that we're talking about, whether it's in Kippur or Kriya Shema or benching or mezuzah or sukkah. There are different things, but the role of education doesn't end, and it's something which goes far and beyond hitting bar and bar mitzvah. Remember, chinuch means to train. But once they're on their own, and they have their own obligations and their own responsibilities, so we still want to make sure they're doing it right, and if they can turn to, whether it's parents or grandparents, and people who can have an influence on their lives, it behooves all of those people to continue to have that influence, and to be involved in hocheach tochiach in a positive way. Whether, as Rabbi Enkin quoted those sources that said that the grandparents should be involved in paying for their education if the parents can't afford it. Okay, that's a discussion you can have with him if you don't like it. But nonetheless, that responsibility is there. It's not just teachers and fathers and mothers. It's anybody who has a legacy in these children, that, as Rabbi Soloveitchik said, who has a responsibility to continue in their education. And we hope that we can have the relationships with our children and with our grandchildren to the point that we can always have that impact, and that they could turn to us for guidance, and they could say, hey, mom, pops, grandma, grandpa, whatever it is, Saba, Safta, Babi, Zaidi, whatever it is that we're called, that they should feel comfortable opening that conversation to ask the questions, and hopefully we can always steer them right, because we're also continuing our own education, because chinuch for children is laying the foundation. But if we have the education as well, our job is also to continue our own education, even if that's not what chinuch is the only meaning of, but we should be continuing our education as well, so that when those children do turn to us and ask us the questions, we shouldn't have to say, oh, I don't know, ask somebody else. We should be able to say, of course, let's sit down and learn this together, because I'm leaving you with a legacy which is so important to who we are.